Hello, friends. We are back of episode 218 of the Our Weekly Highlights podcast. We are a couple days later because, the day job schedule was a bit hectic for yours truly, but we're here now at least. And this is the weekly podcast where we talk about the excellent highlights and additional feedback that we get from our community that's shared every single week at ourweekly.org. My name is Eric Nance, and I'm happy you have joined us from wherever you are around this wide world we live in. And I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Mike Thomas, who hopefully is staying warm up there because a lot of the world is bracing for a winter ice apocalypse, it sounds like, in the coming days.
It's going to be tough here in a lot of the U.S. over the next coming days. I've got a teammate in North Dakota who I think today it was minus 25 Fahrenheit. And then I've got a teammate in Argentina who's currently on a beach playing bocce, and it's 86 degrees. So, depending on where you are in the world, hope you're having a good day.
The dichotomy is large, and yes, we have some big meetings next week at the day job. We have some folks coming from the southern part of the U.S., and they're about to get hammered with ice, and who knows? So we'll see what happens. But no ice apocalypse here on this recording here, at least. So we're gonna dive right into it. We got a couple great highlights to talk about and some very thought-provoking feedback to share at the end. But our curator this week is John Calder. He's also been on the Our Weekly curator team for quite a while. Thanks again, John, for sticking with us for 2026. But as always, he had tremendous help from our fellow Our Weekly team members and contributors like all of you around the world with your pull requests and other wonderful suggestions. And we are going to lead off with a topic we'll probably dive into also a bit in the feedback as well. But there are times when there may be some very interesting cases where being able to get a little helping hand from a large language model might end up saving you a lot of time. However, it needs to be used responsibly because sometimes things can go off the rails a little bit if you're not careful. But we have our first highlight here is one such case that I think many, especially in the package development community, can very much relate to. This is coming to us from Davis Vaughn, who is a engineer on the Posit team, especially regarding the tidyverse packages. And he talks about how he was able to, at least in a semi-automated fashion, submit 200 pull requests to different packages that depend on dplyr with the help of Claude Code. So to set the stage a little bit, the dplyr package, part of the tidyverse, is hugely important in the world of data science, and especially in the world of R. And there are quite a few packages that use this as a dependency. And certainly, I'm sure that's an understatement. And from time to time, certain functionality will either slowly get deprecated or maybe warn to the user that it's, the shelf life of that function is not much longer. And there comes a time when the team does have to make the call to actually rip that function out. But it's always a courtesy when you're developing a package, when you're about to introduce a breaking change, no matter big or small, to at least try to take a look at what packages depend on your said package and try to help that maintainer out with the necessary updates to make sure that their package can be compliant with the latest version of dplyr, for example. So this situation has come around in the current term for the tidyverse team, and Davis was tasked with, once again, trying to figure out what kind of code changes are necessary for, in this case, about 200 packages that utilize this certain functionality in dplyr we're about to talk about. He did a little back of the envelope math of what this typically takes in practice. Usually for packages that he's not familiar with, he'll need about 10 minutes to do some dev time to craft the pull request necessary to help that maintainer with the breaking change fix. So if that's 10 minutes for a PR per package, and there are 200 packages, that roughly works out to about 33 hours of total work. And that might even be underselling it in certain cases because not every case is going to be that uniformly distributed in the amount of time. So he had talked to his team, in particular Hadley, who suggested that Claude Code might actually be a help here. And Davis has been a skeptic of a lot of these tooling and how much it could help him, but he thought this was a good way to kind of test the waters here. So what we're about to talk about is that this did, in fact, help out quite a bit, but it wasn't necessarily that way right away. It did take a little crafting of proper framing and structure, but the TLDR, so to speak, is that this reduced the time to submit these PRs, or at least get the PRs ready for review, from that around 33 hours to about 8 hours, and almost a whole working day at that point. And that's not too shabby. So let's see what actually happened here. This function in question is from the dplyr ID function. He mentions this has been defunct for a while and throwing an error, but that function has still been there in the code base. And we won't dive into why it's been there for this time, but they wanted to rip this function out for this upcoming release. And there are other logistics of, why they wanted to remove it, but that's not really the point here. The point is that with it removed, there are quite a few packages that depend on dplyr that would fail their rcommand checks as a result of whatever they're standardizing on. So this was a time to leverage Claude Code, and in particular the Opus 4.5 model, which is getting a lot of positive attention in the community lately from many in the data science community and beyond. So that's what he went to start with here. And he tasked it with a minimal set of permissions, basically related to GitHub in his bash shell to fork, clone repos, use some R scripting creation, editing R scripts, using cat and find and whatnot. And then Claude came up with a plan, such as, cloning down the package in question with the GH package, setting up a kind of project-based library folder for installing that package and running tests, and being able to analyze the package code, looking for any global variable calls that relates to what they were trying to fix here, running DevTools check to make sure both the CRAN version and the dev version of dplyr were passing in these checks, I should say, with these updated changes. And so that he has the full plan here as in the blog post if you want to look with it. There's a lot to it, but it was tasking Claude Code to do quite a bit. And it gets to work pretty well. It starts to craft these PRs. He started reviewing them. He even has a little screencast of one of those, reviews that he's looking at. But then something happens along the way. One of which is he encountered rate limits from GitHub itself because it was throwing a lot of processes at the GitHub API to do all this cloning, this forking, and then submitting PRs or whatnot. And that was usually he never encountered this before in his daily work, but there are a lot of sub-processes that Claude Code was spinning up behind the scenes, and that will actually wreck everything at some point because Claude Code tried to work around this. So to its credit, it tried to work around it, but it resorted to going to unpacking tarballs from GitHub, like you might in the old days, if you will, and then trying to install these directly. And then the worst part is it didn't help him get that intelligent Git-like diff of the code updates because of this way of installing it and working with the package as opposed to the typical cloning the repo approach. So along the way, it starts to even ignore the plan a little bit altogether, starts to show a bunch of permission warnings about not going to the R package global library. It's just it's encountering a lot of problems, which is causing Davis a lot of problems in this. And his first attempt was to just give it a heck of a lot more permissions in this like JSON settings file And it's a massive list of bash commands here. I don't think any sane person would want to do this in real practice, but he was just trying to get anything to solve it at this point. But it was just like little Band-Aids. It wasn't quite doing what he had in mind. And then at some point, he just wanted to take a step back and try to figure out Claude itself, it seemed like, was trying to do a bit too much. Especially this idea of managing all the Git, operations, interactions, setting up the package libraries. We have tooling in the R community to automate a lot of that stuff already. The LLM doesn't really need to do that, right? So what he said, he take a step back. Let's say, okay, how about I clone all these 50 packages into a single directory via an R script. You could easily loop through that. Generate the necessary library subdirectories, the R profiles, again, a script that can do that, and then create this list in a bullet, like in a text way, of all the 50 packages it's going to work on so that you could track the progress pretty easily throughout Claude Code's operation, and let Claude Code do what what Davis really needed help with, was getting these new code updates, getting the diffs so that Davis could review them in his, positron type IDE setup, and then submit the pull request after his review. With this updated plan, which you can look to in the blog post as well, it worked much, much better. It did try, there was maybe some permission things here and there, but they were largely circumvented with this approach because his global R library is never touched by Claude Code trying to do something crazy with it. And the diffs were actually right as he wanted. He was able to look at the different patches. He has an example for the Benthos package you can look at. And that's the stuff that he was dreading to do, and Claude Code did a decent job of it. So again, there's a screencast here to look at all this in action, but one might say, hey, this is great, but I've heard there can be a lot of token usage for all this. So the end of the post does look at the cost, figures. And sure enough, when he ran the /cost command in Claude Code, it amounts to about $150-ish, a little less than that. Now, of course, that's not trivial by any means. However, if you think about Posit paying him to do this drudgery for the amount of time it was kind of done in typical practice in a manual fashion, probably seems like a bargain compared to what a salaried pay might actually get or a contractor pay. So seems like we turn around Davis's perspective on this in this case of it, but I want to hit home a couple things. One, the first attempt definitely was a result of Claude Code trying to do too much at once, and when it ran into problems there, it introduced more problems. And that is something that is quite common in this space from what I'm hearing. These ambitious plans, if anything goes awry, human intervention is needed at some point anyway. So that tight scope, I think, is really important. But this is something where it's not like he was asking Claude Code to do some novel, brand new functionality, right? It's just updating the code bases of these packages to utilize, or at least not utilize, a deprecated function, but not break anything else that package does. It's literally just to make it past the command check. So I think with that tight focus, combined with what he learned in the first attempt of it, this is an intriguing case for, those on the development side that want a little help with the little drudgery that can happen in like I said, package development life. So it definitely gave me some things to think about, Mike. But that was one of those cases where things go crazy at first, but if you persevere through it and take a step back, you might be able to get something useful out of Claude Code after all.
I was actually watching this in real time on my GitHub feed, as I imagine many folks who follow Davis on GitHub did as well, because there's a lot of activity that was going on. And my initial reactions were, one, whoa, this makes me happy to see people being empathetic towards others, which in my humble opinion is a staple of open source, by taking the time to reach out to all of the reverse dependency packages that you're going to affect before they get the CRAN archive warning email. And my second reaction was, this must have been a ton of work. But as we get the peek behind the curtains here, it's really interesting the way that, Davis was able to leverage Claude Code for this particular task, and not only just show us, what worked, but also show us what didn't work, and really appreciate him pasting some of his Claude Code markdown instructions in the blog post. I had also never seen that permission style JSON file with all of those bash commands before, so that was new to me. Claude Code is something that I haven't played around enough with, and I certainly need to do some more of. And I always wonder if the amount of time and mental effort it takes to put together these markdown instructions or skills or whatever for Claude or your LLM of choice is actually going to save time compared to just writing the code itself, and all that troubleshooting in the middle. And I think the reason that LLMs are so good at generating code is how much more black and white code is compared to every other like text-based, training data like conversations and books and blogs. Code is literally the representation of answering a question, but there's very little ambiguity in code compared to answering a question in natural language, right? Which could be interpreted a bunch of different ways. But anyways, this is probably obvious now, but it's something I still struggle with, and maybe resonates with others out there that still enjoy writing code like myself, instead of writing Markdown all the time to make code and then carefully reviewing that code after the fact. Although I absolutely love it and use it every day for debugging or making smaller scale changes and stuff like that. I just haven't jumped 2 feet in yet, I feel like. And, like you, Eric, I really appreciate his insights into the actual ROI with his Claude costs at the end of the blog post, because if you are doing this on a personal project and just let it rip, right, you could rack up a couple $100 that may surprise you if you're not keeping an eye on that as well. So
yeah, and I'm still very early in my journey of just turning Claude Code loose on like a brand new project yet. I'm slowly going to get there, I think, for some cases, and I hear the chatter in many other sectors, and of course others in data science as well. I know Hadley's even sent some posts on Blue Sky recently about some packages he's made entirely through a Claude Code vibe coding session, and he of all people have gotten that to work well. So I mean that speaks something right there. So, but I think the scoping side of it is what I'll remember the most, is that let's not forget the great innovations that have already happened from like an automation perspective in our community for a lot of the drudgery that goes before the code is even ready, which of course is in this case was cloning the repos, getting them installed in packaged, library environments. This is something in life sciences we have to be very careful with, because we often have project-specific libraries for different, clinical stuff. So this is something that I want to lean into the existing stuff to automate that, but then let Claude or whatever your LLM provider of choice do the drudgery that gets to the actual code stuff, which these new models are getting really good at. So yeah, I think Davis, hearing his perspective from a self-professed skeptic of how this might help him out personally, these stories more and more are what resonate with me the most. These practical, very transparent ways of sharing their development workflow of this, I think, has been very helpful. So kudos to Davis for an awesome post here. Rounding out our highlights today, we're going to take a visit to our visualization corner here, which is always an adventure on an audio podcast, but an area that definitely gets talked about a bit, but a lot of times might be some misconceptions around it. And that's a topic of making sure our visualizations are accessible in the ways that it can reach the most broad audience, not just those that have the benefit of, healthy vision and whatnot, but those that may have difficulties in looking at these visualizations. What can be done with the aesthetics to make these more readable to them? But it's not always just on a compromise standpoint. One might think that it totally changes the output of this plot, but no, it's more about enhancing the communication of it. And who better in this space to talk about this than Nicola Rini, who has been so prevalent in her visualization adventures and thought leader, making her own visualization guides and so much more. Her blog post is talking about how to make a more accessible line chart. And in this, the line chart's actually not that complicated. She has an example here with code of it looks like a 4-line plot with a month on the x-axis, the y value going from 0.2 to 0.6, and different categories. And they got the default kind of color palette, pretty thin lines, but there are lots of things that can be improved. But what is the things that can help the most without compromising the overall intent of this plot? One of which is the size of the lines. They are a bit thin in the early going, so just updating the size of these, and in this case with ggplot2, that's just a simple line width call in the geom line. You can now see the lines with a lot better thickness. They pop out a lot more on the background. That's just one aspect. The other aspect is colors, which if you have the ability to distinguish colors, through normal means, you don't think as much about this. But the eye-opening thing that happens is what happens for the colors that were chosen here if you force those to be a grayscale. And you see this in the second pick here. There are gray lines, and I can't make heads or tails from one to the other out what differences they are. They all look gray to me. That's a wake-up call that maybe you should look at a color blind-friendly palette. And that is where there are some great resources that are shared here. One of which is there is a new palette that I believe has become, as of R4.0, the default palette for base R plots, called the Ito, I believe. And that is right there. And once she makes that change, these colors both look good from like the default color perspective. But I believe if they were converted to grayscale, they would show very sharp contrast between the 4 lines. She also links to a great resource called Viz Palette to evaluate different color palette options if you want some choice in this, and how they might look to those that are, experiencing a different visual, deficiency. So great way to check your color palettes. Oftentimes that alone is a huge win to make these plots more accessible. Other tips include maybe annotating the plot so it's not just color itself that's driving the main story, and maybe the lines are more complex and it's harder to see the different patterns. Having an annotation at the end of the plot can be very helpful for these, as well as perhaps different symbols of the points if they're connected via points. Sometimes things get a little busier when you do that, so you use that, responsibly, but these are all visual cues to make things more distinguishable while preserving the overall intent of the plot. Other suggestions include faceting, which can be very helpful, where you hide the other lines in a more, background kind of fashion and only make the line that should be the focus of the facet really pop out. That's definitely one approach there, as well as augmenting the plot with additional text. That can be very helpful too. And then she has a before and after from that default ggplot to this, very nicely styled annotated plot with facets that can definitely be very helpful in communicating this to those across different backgrounds for visual interpretation. Lots of great notes here shared here by Nicola, as always. Additional resources as well that she plugs, and this blog post is fantastic, especially if you're just looking for a very practical example of how to up your game, so to speak, with accessibility without compromising your overall intent. Very good stuff here from Nicola.
That big decision on how wide to make the lines in my line charts is always something I'm super particular about.
Yes.
Got a feeling I'm not the only one. And I was very interested in taking a look at that color palette that you mentioned there, Oka Beato or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's supposed to be, I think, a lot more friendly. I did try to print it in grayscale, and the contrast looked good except for the middle 2 lines. They looked almost identical, but it was very easy to tell the other lines apart. So I would imagine, maybe if you are someone who's red-green colorblind or something like that, that it might be a lot more accessible of a palette than some of the defaults that we get. Still can't believe it's still, every time I generate a pure ggplot without adjusting the theme at all and that gray background and those thin lines, it's like I can't type, theme minimal or theme BW fast enough.
You and me both. Yep.
But I always, really appreciate the creativity that Nicola brings to these blog posts, and, particularly the concept of these line charts where you dull or sort of make reduce the contrast, right, of the lines that you still want to provide for context, but maybe aren't the main focus of the narrative that you're trying to portray. That's not a technique that I use enough. I need to start using that more. One that I do use all the time is kind of sticking your conclusion right in the title and the subtitle as well. Which is, I'm a big fan favorite of, particularly when you're communicating data results to non-technical stakeholders. It really makes that communication go a lot more efficiently than, when I used to have to sort of explain what the chart was saying in the past. Just stick it right there in the title. It's a free tip. The other thing that Nicola put in this blog post that is from a woman named Amy Cecil, it's her advice for writing alt text for data viz, I found very interesting. She has sort of this framework where you start with the chart type. So you're explaining in your alt text, you use this template that's chart type of the type of data that you're showing, and then you include your reason for including the chart. And I think that's fantastic. It's reusable, especially if you are someone who's trying to include alt text, but sometimes, need just a little bit of a starter to help you out. This is a great blog post to come back to for Amy's advice here. So thank you, Nicola, as always.
Yep. And all the code is here, and her site looks fantastic. This is a quartal refresh blog. She mentioned she was doing some additional tweaks on it, and it looks like they're looking fantastic, including the cover page, a nice little purple pinkish hex splash at the top. That's all good stuff. I love it. Absolutely love it. So just a small sample this week, but another powerful issue that we have available this week. And before we close out here, we do want to address some very thought-provoking feedback we got from the last episode. And friend of the show, John Harmon, sent me a note on Blue Sky about his take on what we covered at the end, towards the end of last week's episode, about the tinyshinyserver package that we did, correctly point out definitely was AI LLM generated. But John was a little, how to say, not too thrilled that this made it through both on the CRAN and into our weekly's feed itself. So first, John, thank you. I always enjoy hearing from you. One thing I think we need to be realistic about is that, what CRAN does with this, that's some of the decision they're going to have to make. But I do think at some point, this is going to become a bit more common than maybe we're ready to admit to. But I do think we were pretty fair about our assessment that neither Mike or I have any illusions about using this in a production setting anytime soon. And a lot of what tinyshinyserver is trying to do sounds too good to be true. And in many cases, it literally is too good to be true because it can't accomplish some of the key things that it outlines in its README, which was massive. And definitely, as I was scrolling through at that time, reviewing it, was a bit on the ambitious side, to say the least. I think there is still a time and place to get help through LLMs to generate package code development, as we just heard from our first highlight here. But we are trying to be fair to what are the trends in the R community and what comes to R Weekly. So we do understand the feedback, but I think it's an important conversation, or at least a point that will probably become more common, maybe not in this extreme example of tinyshinyserver, but a lot of software development now is going to get help from LLMs in various ways, shape, or form. And we'll see what happens in the future. But I think it was still important enough to cover regardless.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with all those sentiments. And you're right that we're going to be seeing more of this, I would imagine, come through. And I would have to guess that this is something that PyPI is just getting inundated with, right? Maybe one of the pros of being, more on the R side is that we're a smaller community, so we don't necessarily have to deal with maybe as much of the slop as AI slop, as John puts it, that I have to imagine the Python community is facing, just because more training data, more users, more Python code out there. I mean, Korean may have to do some self-assessment around this. They have good, in my opinion, guardrails, frameworks, sometimes overly strict guardrails in a lot of cases. I think people feel that way for something being able to pass all the checks and get on to CRAN. So the fact that this made it through means that it must have passed all of those checks, which is interesting. And maybe something to spend a little more time researching on. Maybe there's no unit tests, right? So it's easier to pass. Maybe the examples are very minimal. Something to take a look at.
Yeah, and obviously John and I are both working literally in the same industry right now, and we do have to take careful looks at package quality, not just that they're on CRAN period, but what they actually do. So nothing that happened here is going to change our perspective on assessing these from a human level. But let's be frank here, well before LLMs, CRAN has over 20,000 packages. Not every one of those is going to be, quote unquote, the most useful for our daily task. And they may do things that over time just deprecate for various reasons, for no fault of anybody. But in the end, you, the person listening, the customer of this package, for whatever analysis you're doing, you need to be the correct, the reviewer of it and be accountable, especially if you're putting this in production, no matter what industry you're in. If you're putting in a package, or depending on the package for a production thing, Mike and I build, production grade apps in our literal day job right now. We are always very careful about what we take on from a dependency. And if we can't stand by it, nope, it's out. We're going to do something else instead. So that part never goes away. And of course, what never goes away is our weekly itself. We love hearing from you. Let's hope it never goes away anyway. And you can get in touch with the project at rweekly.org. The link to pull requests to send us that great new resource that you found is right there at the top of the page. You can also get in touch with us, like John did, on our social medias. I am at our podcast at bsky.social on Blue Sky. I'm also on Mastodon at our podcast at podcastindex.social. And I'm on LinkedIn. You just search my name and you'll find me there. And Mike, where can the listeners find you?
You can find me on Blue Sky at mike-thomas.bsky.social. You can find me on LinkedIn if you search Ketchbrook Analytics, KETCHBROOK. And excited to announce that I will be speaking at the RISC, the 2026 RISC conference. That's R with an exclamation point, SK, put on by our consortium for those doing at the intersection of data science and risk management. So check it out. It's online in February. We'll link in the show notes.
Awesome stuff. I'm really happy to hear that. I'll have to tune in. That sounds like a fun event. So, yep, as Mike said, we'll link all that in the show notes. And we're going to link ourselves out of here. We got our day jobs calling back, so we're going to close up shop for this edition of our Weekly Highlights. And we will be back with another edition of our Weekly Highlights next week.